The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SLA CI Division webinar, How to Translate a Business Question into a Market Opportunity and Formulate Creative Research Solutions with Limited Resources. Our speaker today is Chad Grunhout. And before I introduce Chad, I wanted to first thank our sponsor for today's webinar, Aurora WDC. If you haven't registered for their upcoming Reconverge G2 conference in Madison in April, you still have time. Participants this year will bring in a business problem and spend the 4-day seminar using intelligence tools and techniques to come up with action plans to bring back to their organization. Visit www.reconverge.net for more information and registration options. And now, before we get started today, I would like to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Chad Grunhout. Chad is a market analyst at Alice Information Management in Midland, Michigan. He manages key client accounts and has responsibility for a variety of projects ranging from news monitoring, competitor analysis, and market opportunity assessment. He has experience working in a variety of industries, including pharmaceuticals, specialty chemicals, consumer goods, manufacturing, and healthcare. He earned a master's in English from the University of Buffalo and a master's degree in library and information science from Wayne State University. He previously worked in reference and technical services at public and academic libraries and is a former college composition instructor. Chad is certified as a competitive intelligence professional through the Strategic and Competitive Intelligence Professionals Association and the Fold Gilad Herring Academy of Competitive Intelligence, and has been active in the Special Libraries Association Competitive Intelligence Division. Without further ado, I'd like to have Chad kick it off for us. And just a reminder that if you have any questions, to please pose them in the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, and I will pose them to Chad at the end of the webinar. Enjoy. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Rosie. And good afternoon, everyone, or maybe it's morning for some of you, depending on where you're calling in. I'm excited to be able to talk with you this afternoon for this opportunity. I gave a version of this presentation last year to a meeting of Michigan business librarians. It was through the Michigan SLA chapter, actually. And essentially what I'm doing is introducing an idea of economic development called economic gardening, but also walking you through several engagements I was involved in where I had very limited time and resources and had to find some interesting ways to help answer a business need of the client. And so it isn't so much a specific technique or technology. In a way, it's kind of showcasing, a unique human element that we all have, curiosity, creativity, some things that can kind of get pushed to the background sometimes when we're talking about data analysis and specific techniques. I think it's a refreshing reminder that the human element is still very, very important in information research and analysis. So once we get moving here we go. Okay. So here we're just starting off on our journey. I took a CI course in grad school at Wayne State, and I was struck by this idea of the information professional being a translator between the business world and the research world, and having to take language that CEOs are using product portfolios, value proposition, revenue growth, the things that matter in their world, and carrying that over into our domain, whether it's a search strategy or a specific database, and again, translating that back into terms that the CEO can understand. They're the expert in running their business, but we're the experts at research and being able to turn that need into a research strategy. And being able to talk with the CEO ahead of time and be honest about what resources you have available and what your strengths and limitations are. Because I'm sure we've all experienced a request that is pretty near impossible, especially given the time and the money that you've been allocated. In times you need to be realistic and say, well, given what we have, here is the closest I can get for you. Because I have overpromised before, and therefore I have gone over budget to meet that promise. So this little quote here: creativity requires the courage to let go of certainties. When I started economic gardening, and I'll explain what economic gardening is in the next slide, it was about 5 years ago, and I was just a year into my CI career here at AIM. I had come over from the academic and public library world. I just got started in business consulting here. And the work I've been doing at AIM to that point, I could be creative with my research process, with the deliverables and that kind of thing. But I had a very well-defined set of go-to resources. I relied on Mintel or JP Morgan equity analyst reports for, market projections and market size, market share, and that kind of thing, right? When I started doing EG with much less time and money available, I had to venture out into the world of, in a sense, creating my own projections based on limited data that I had available. So I was certainly confronted with this challenge of getting uncomfortable and doing something that I thought only people with PhD in econometrics would be able to do. And certainly it's not to say what I'm about to show here is on that level, but just that idea of kind of getting outside of your comfort zone. So economic gardening, it started in the late 1980s in Littleton, Colorado. And what happened was the city had lost about 7,500 jobs due to a large defense manufacturer making cuts. And the city was highly dependent upon that company for jobs, so they were devastated. The business affairs person at the time, Chris Gibbons, who founded this economic gardening concept, took an approach different than other economic development at the time. Whether it was tax incentives or business plan reviews, cash flow analysis. He proposed an idea where it's a team-based approach involving geographic information systems, GIS, search engine optimization, and good old market research. And so essentially it's sales leads, online presence, and finding and capitalizing on market opportunities. It became a national program in around 2010, and it's now in over 25 states. Generally, it's a state-funded program. Here in Michigan, it's funded through the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, and they receive state funding. So the program is free, quote unquote, essentially no cost to the business. But obviously the taxpayers are footing the bill. The idea is to support businesses within the state using resources in the state. So we at AIM and at other companies throughout the state work as contractors, and we work with called second stage companies. So they've moved beyond the startup phase. They're in a growth period. They've shown that they can be viable. You can see the employee and revenue range listed there. And essentially what happens is, there's an intake process for the companies just to make sure they meet the criteria. There will be a discovery call to get a sense of what the company's needs are. They'll do what's called a customer walkthrough to help us understand their business. So from start to end, what it looks like as a customer walking through their business. Then there will be a team call, which gets the market research, SEO, and GIS all together to ask their specific questions and come up with a research plan with typically it's a CIO, CEO. Then the specialists go off and do their work. We come back and check in with the company to see, if we're on the right track, if they need any further research. And then there's a final call at the end to wrap everything up and get feedback from the client to see how the process went. It varies. Generally, it's about a month. It can go a little longer, but it's been a very, very interesting experience. It's kind of a distributed framework in that people from a lot of different companies and background areas are pulled into this program. And so you get a lot of different experience skills brought together for one company. And I've probably done maybe 70, 80 of these engagements since I started. They are 36 hours a piece, but that's split up between all of the different people. So market research gets 9 hours minus an hour for the call. So you have 8 hours of research, report writing, and talking with the client time. Now, considering a lot of the other projects I'm involved in, that's very, very little time. And there is not a resource budget for buying market reports and that kind of thing. So just as a way to walk through some of these engagements that I've been on, I decided to use the one version of the intelligence process that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. This is used by the U.S. Armed Forces. The CIA has their version. There's been many different versions. Some get more complicated. I don't explicitly use it, but in reflecting back on most of my projects, this fits pretty well with how things flow. In a very simplistic manner, it would be completely linear from planning all the way back to dissemination. But I like how this shows the evaluation and feedback, circumscribing all of this. So, you might go out and do your initial research and find you need to circle back with a client and start over at planning and direction again, right? So at each point, you can always circle back. So it's not always just a linear process. But I find it's a very just useful heuristic for looking at how a research process goes. So the first example I want to look at is with a small company here in Michigan that had a new process for recycling of manufacturing byproducts. And specifically, it had to do with automotive waste and waste from furniture manufacturers. So things like powder coating waste used in furniture manufacturing. in the paint shops, the manufacturing locations, half of the product usually would end up on the floor. Just the nature of how it was being done. Basically electrostatic spraying of paint pigments in a dry form. And so tons and tons of this waste were being generated and being sent to landfill. Same thing in auto manufacturing, where you're doing a lot of metal cutting and things for transmission cases. Filters would be used to clean the coolant that is used to operate the machinery. And that coolant would end up collecting debris and metal shavings and all that kind of thing. And again, a lot of times this material would just be sent to the landfill. So his idea was to recycle this material in some manner. For example, the leftover pigment could be put back into textile manufacturing, or the filter media could be recycled into an industrial scrubber, on a smokestack at a factory or something. So he was seeking investor funding for his idea. He was writing up a business plan, and he needed market data on what the overall opportunity was in the United States. He had done some initial digging and was not having much success. So, our challenge here was to find data on a fairly niche market. So the initial research I did, fortunately, the client had some customer data from several of the automotive plants that he was, he had already clients with these companies. And also looking at annual reports from the publicly traded companies to see if they report any data, sustainability reports and things like that, where they're talking about zero to waste landfill and things like that. And also directly contacting, whether it's here in Michigan, the Department of Environmental Quality, or a waste company, Waste Management. And what we get out of this is, confirmation, right? There is no readily available market report on these waste streams and how much is going to landfill. The regulatory data just does not get specific enough. Regulatory in terms of, EPA monitoring what types of waste are going to landfills and that kind of thing. And the waste company data is confidential. So we're off to a really great start right now. And so the analysis phase here is we have the starting data, as I mentioned, from the company. So the idea is to make a assumption, and that would be that data we have in Michigan is representative across the United States at the other auto manufacturing facilities. That's a huge assumption, obviously. And the recurring theme through all of these engagements is constant communication with the client to make sure that they're comfortable with assumptions that you're making, that what their comfort level is. And so, we can't just willy-nilly go about making these assumptions. We have to run it by the client and make sure, look, this is the best that we can do. This is the closest approximation we can get. And so from that point, if we have data on a couple facilities in Michigan, then the next step could be to figure out, okay, well, how many auto manufacturing plants are there in the US? And again, who are the major furniture manufacturers to determine how many facilities they have? And one of the data gaps we had here was we didn't know how much of this powder coat waste was being generated by, Hayworth and things like that. So fortunately came across an industry publication, an interview with a Hayworth executive talking about what the average amount of waste, powder coat waste actually being produced is. So, you know, you could certainly pick apart at any stage here problems, right? I mean, we have one data point, it's anecdotal, and, you know, when we can, we need to verify. But again, working with the time and budget constraints, making sure the client is comfortable with the assumptions that you're making, we can proceed to provide at least some information rather than nothing. And the next step is to, you know, make sure that the data that you're using is consistent. Are you working in tons or pounds, making conversions, and checking, double checking, and triple checking your calculations, obviously. And this is just kind of an example of some of the outputs that we got from this. And what I want to emphasize too is the transparency of the data and the calculations. Because if your assumption is relies on other assumptions, or if it's too conservative, the client can change the data and the calculations to come out with something that might make more sense to them. So being able to provide the actual data to them, I think really establishes credibility in what you're doing and trust in you that you're not doing some hocus pocus stuff. And so you'll also see at the bottom is a very detailed methodology explaining all the steps and assumptions that you've made. And so throughout this process too, I like to keep record of what steps I'm making and what, you know, data transformations and things like that I am making, so I can go back when I write this methodology and explain how I've been, you know, massaging the data. And I don't know how many people use Excel pivot tables. I know Excel might be a dirty word for a lot of people, but I found pivot tables to be extremely helpful and useful. And to be honest, early on, they were intimidating. But getting your data in the right format to be able to use for that will be a huge, huge time saver. And I am happy to talk with anyone offline who may not be familiar with it and wants to get into it. Happy to talk or chat by email, whatever, to help you get started on that. Because it really also saves you time, and duplicating charts and data reduces errors and things like that. So, and then also there is an output from our GIS guy, who basically plotted out the locations of the different manufacturing facilities. And one cool thing about this is, so that gray line running north and south is I-75, and that is obviously a major transportation corridor, and you can see most of the facilities. That big cluster of red is Detroit, Grand Rapids is in yellow. And we see this for obvious reasons. You see this in a lot of other industries too, where facilities can line up around that main transportation corridor, and that's useful for salespeople in terms of planning sales trips and trying to be most efficient with your time. Where is the best place to start your efforts? So this is one example where you know, we had some starting data from the clients, and it was a matter of determining the other locations throughout the country and extrapolating from there. And we did this for each waste stream. So there was paint, sludge, filter media, and that powder coat waste. And so what I want to show at the next example is a way to kind of finesse that assumption. You know, we were saying, all right, this data that we have for these particular plants, that's going to be representative for every facility in the US. And of course, that's not true. In the next case, I want to show how we can get, we can kind of incorporate that assumption in our calculations. So in this case, we're looking at the what would you call this? The entertainment industry, the experience industry, escape rooms, basically. We had a couple open up here in Midland, and this company had about 6 or 7 escape rooms set up. They had started about 7 years ago, and they would slowly add one or two a year, and they were starting to feel crowded out. Every time they would have open up a new room, competitor would come in. Their question, the strategic question was, do we continue to operate in this area? Or is it so saturated that it just doesn't make sense to open a business if it's not going to be profitable? And so again, do we exit this industry, or do we keep opening new facilities? And they needed to know what is the size of the prize? What is the ultimate size of this market? If we can get an estimate of what the current market is and what the potential is, they can better gauge if it's worth opening new locations. So again, the client had some customer data on what the average revenue, what the average person pays for an escape room, what the average revenue is for certain locations. And then we also looked at news interviews, market reports, to get a sense of what other places are charging their customers and what the average, how many people they get per month or per year. US Census data was used to be able to extrapolate out to the entire population. And fortunately, in this case, there was a directory of escape room locations. So the idea here is, if we can get a sense of the average, how many people go to an escape room, what the average charge is, and how many escape rooms in total there are throughout the country, we would have a sense of what the market size is. And then using census data, if we can determine how many people match the demographic profile of the people attending escape rooms right now, we could get a sense of how many other people you could potentially reach with this service, right? You know, challenges here are, it's a very dynamic market. It's difficult to track because escape rooms are opening and closing all the time. The data is scattered. There is not one consistent location to be able to find this kind of market data. The revenue estimates varied widely. One location could report $1,200 a month, and another was saying $20,000 a month. And so it's decision time, right? Do you say, look, there's no way, you go back to the client and say, I just can't come up with anything out of this. It's just a mess. We need to find another way to approach this, and go back to the drawing board. Or do you propose, well, let's make the most of what we have, if you're willing to make a couple assumptions with me. So, you know, the most obvious assumption here is that, you know, the revenues that we're seeing reported by escape room owners, again, it's this representativeness issue. Assume that it's nationally representative. And of course, there are issues with that. One way to kind of get a little more accurate with that is to deal with the wide range in data, right? So a national average we saw was escape room would make $1,600 a week, while a location in Seattle is saying, oh, they're making $11,500 a week. That's a huge, huge range. And to just use the national average as representative would clearly be skewing things much more conservatively. So one way to do that is to take a look at a pattern that's happening in those locations that are making more per week. And it's probably not much of a surprise with the bigger cities. And so what we can do then is come up with estimates for cities. Estimates for those cities that are kind of on the smaller end, and also incorporates the higher revenue for the larger cities. So you can kind of create a low end and a high end estimate to account for that variability. And again, just some example outputs. This isn't one report, these are snapshots of different deliverables, just to give you a sense of how I was reporting this out. So in the upper left there, the weekly revenue at escape rooms, this is giving a snapshot of how variable the revenue estimates were. And so on the right side is giving these low end and high end estimates. Like at a conservative, if we just took an average of 1,600 a week and multiply that out by the calculations, here's what it would look like. But if we used a different average, incorporating other numbers, we would get a much higher end estimate. And obviously you could take the average of that. You can let the client determine what they're comfortable in assuming. And showing the calculations that are being done, I think, is extremely important. I've been frustrated when I buy a market report and I try to dig into the methodology or understand how certain calculations were done, and I'm just not seeing how they did that. And I understand there's the secret sauce and there's proprietary methodologies and things like that. But to the extent that you can, to let the client know what data manipulations that you were doing. So again, they now are enabled to do their own calculations by making other assumptions. And I think, again, it just establishes credibility between you and the clients, that, hey, we have your best interest at heart. We're not trying to hide anything from you. This is the best that we were able to do with the data that we had available. And again, just showing the data format in the Excel file, again, using pivot tables to consolidate all this information, do charting and graphing and calculations and that kind of thing. So I want to show a last example here where this was it was a software company, had branched out into a software company. They were a construction management company, and they helped construction managers allocate their resources, where to decide to most efficiently use their capital in large, hundreds of billion-dollar construction projects. And his issue, and again, with economic gardening, we tend to deal with companies that might have 10 dozen people or something like that. And here the CEO was kind of doing everything. He was the one who knew this. He knew how to do this consulting with companies better than anyone else at the company. But he felt there were so many other opportunities out there, so he wanted to figure out, how does he scale himself? How do I make more of me? And so he developed this software that incorporates many of the techniques he was using. The idea was to license this out to construction consultants and construction companies, and then train them on using that software, so to generate another source of revenue. So the question for them before launching this is, who do we target this to first? What are those industries that are seeing the most spending on construction, right? He wanted to go after those with the highest amount of capital, who would be willing to spend money on training and licensing for software like this. So doing the research pulls up varied sources. So we have the American Institute of Architects. They have a forecast for construction spending in different industries. The U.S. Census also puts out reports on construction in place. There are others, FMI construction. There were, 4 or 5 different sources reporting forecasts on different industries and for different time periods. So, and also the industry definitions varied amongst these reports. So here's a case where ideally, again, the time and the budget constraints, you want to find 1 or 2 sources that are fairly consistent. But in this case, it looked like, in a way, we needed to create our own consensus forecast based on all of these other forecasts. So, several assumptions. Obviously, one of them would be, as always, right, would be that the economic conditions are going to remain stable, that these forecasts are going to be valid in the next year or 2, and no major disruptions occur. The terminology, just working out, each has a different definition of sector. For example, utilities or retail or wholesale, they each can incorporate different types of businesses within those categories. And just being sure you're clear about what they mean by construction spending. In this case, I made sure we were looking just at construction put in place, which the census reports on. And again, the standard process of standardizing any data, making sure everything is consistent, and checking, double checking, triple checking the calculations. And so here's a couple examples of some output of this, just showing essentially the data format and layout. Again, for people who might not be familiar with using Excel pivot tables, there's just a little learning curve in making sure that the data is laid out in the right format. And then from there, making many different types of charts is extremely easy. And I think nope, let me go back. Zoom in here. All right. And so, this is what this is showing then is a consolidation of 4 different forecasts, and putting that and consolidating it down into one visual. And to be able to see, here is the value in the next year and 2 years, what the top ranking industries are, to determine where he needs to target his efforts in terms of marketing the software. And so again, in this case, it's a matter of standardizing terminology, making sure that you're comparing apples to apples when you're looking at different sources. So what I want to do overall is, obviously there's a lot of details and things you can go into for, the averaging and the calculations you're doing, the assumptions you're making. As I said before, I'm sure everyone out there is seeing different ways of doing it. Other data you would have pulled in, maybe you would try to triangulate data, verify data. There's many different steps that are going on. But I just wanted to present kind of a workflow that I use throughout these projects, where, again, you have 5-6 hours to do something. You don't have a budget to buy a report, so you have to use publicly freely accessible information. Do not hesitate to ask the clients if they have any data they can share with you. I've made the mistake of not doing that and presenting what I thought was a brilliant finding, only to hear that they already knew about it, or they already had the report. Obviously, that's quite embarrassing. So don't hesitate. So what work have you already done? Is there any data that you can share with me? make sure that the data you're using is consistent. So whether it's one report could be looking at tons, and another report you're looking at is talking about pounds. It seems obvious, but one little error like that can make a huge difference at the end of the day. You know, different time periods. One report might be forecasting to 2018, another one goes out to 2019. You know, that kind of thing, looking at what assumptions those reports were making, all of those, you know, terminology issues. And all of this should get incorporated into the methodology to explain what the limitations of your data and research sources are. And the assumptions that you're making to make these projections, for example, that Michigan auto manufacturing plant waste production is equivalent to all other facilities in the US. Obviously that's not true, but you have to start somewhere, and as long as it's based in something the client is comfortable with, then it's reasonable to proceed. And I've done this kind of thing with, you know, several $1 million companies up to $100 million companies. And as long as you are in communication with them about what you're doing, you know, I had to remind myself too, everyone else is doing the same thing, right? The equities analysts, they have their forecasting models, and the market research companies. I'm not criticizing them. I'm just saying that everyone is making some kind of assumption, and it's okay for us to do that as long as we make it clear. You know, formatting your data in the right format, especially if you're going to be using an Excel pivot table, maybe you're keeping it in a database. Make sure you record all of the steps that you're making. I mean, even it could be down to the level of, I made a column in Excel that added together these values and I used this formula or something like that. Something that can help you when you go back to write the methodology to clearly state out what your process was. I was on a call with a client it was about 2 years ago, and I had done something similar to this on a larger scale. As for the pet fence market, you know, the invisible fences, and I got grilled on a lot of different areas about why certain assumptions were being made, what kind of calculations were being done, and fairly so. And if I hadn't been clearly keeping track of what I had been doing, I could have very easily gotten tripped up and made sound like I had no idea what I was doing. But once I was able to explain this is what I was doing, the client was much more reassured in accepting the calculations I was making. Right, and this goes to just understanding that the data is limited, and there are only so many things you can do with it. And to proceed accordingly, like in that one case, doing a high-end projection, a low-end projection, something like that. This methodology and sharing the data and the calculations. Maybe in some cases that won't be possible, but to the extent that you can, the more transparent you can be, the better your relationship with the client will be. You know, so this is reiterating a lot of what I was saying, but over the years, I've gotten more and more in tune with the idea that maybe more important than the research and the analysis is knowing your client and having a good relationship with them. On short, small engagements, it's hard to develop that kind of relationship, I understand. But you know, for there to be a successful outcome, for them to have a product they can rely on and share with their executives and develop business plans on, they need to know that the research you were doing was consistent, methodical, and any assumptions you made are made clear, and that they have the power to be able to manipulate the data in a way that makes sense for them. So, you know, just to conclude with the good old Albert Einstein here, creativity is intelligence having fun. And again, I said at the outset that the focus isn't so much on a particular technique or methodology. It was more of that human element of curiosity and creativity that we all have. I think that's why we're in this profession, and the desire to help people solve a problem, I think is important to hear, given with our, you know, increasingly automated world, still in a world where a lot of folks think that just Googling something can get them what they need. So I kind of wanted to throw out there this idea of creativity as an important part of our, you know, information research and analysis procedure. And I'm definitely curious to hear of anyone who has their own experiences with this, good or bad. If you have a different process, if there's any success stories about how you kind of had to make the best of a little, and just kind of get a conversation started around that. And I'm certainly obviously happy to answer any specific questions about my technique or process and that kind of thing. Can I turn it back to you?
Yes, Chad, we do have several questions.
Okay.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and those case studies with us. Just generated some inquiries from our audience. So we'll just start with the first one here. Thoughts on how you balance your time massaging information versus using a fee-based service that has the content in a more user-friendly format?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. In a case where it's very limited time, honestly, it isn't much of a question, because what I would have to pay for that fee-based resource, even if it was $1,000 report or something, or $400 report, I wouldn't even have the budget to be able to buy that. So in some cases, it's just not even an issue. But to get more to the point, and it would depend on the source, right? There's some sources I'd feel more comfortable buying that had most of the data I already needed in place. If that meant not spending 5 hours of research and massaging and all of that, and I could spend more of my time with analysis and drawing out suggestions of action for the company, in that case, it would make more sense to just buy the report. If at the same time, if it can't get as specific as the client needs it to be, you know, I would say it gets down to the client's comfort level. If they would be okay with the higher level approximation in a report that might not get as granular as I feel I can get with my more labor intensive method, right? I would want to ask them what they feel where to spend the money and time. If they come back and say, look, we're more interested in getting as specific as we can to our market, which we know is very niche, then I would feel they value my time spent on analyzing the data to get to conclusions. If they said, well, no, that's fine, the market report, it gets close enough to what we need, that'll help us a lot, then it would make sense to go ahead and buy the report, I think. So I hope that somewhat answers. It kind of depends on the context and what the clients need, but that is a fantastic question. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Chad. The next question, I know you sort of addressed this somewhat at the end, but I will pose it to you anyways. what sort of feedback have you received from your clients? Have they seen success, felt that they were able to make a good decision based on your information?
That is a wonderful, wonderful question. I wish I was able to hear back more months, years down the road on where the company is, based upon the research I provided. I know in the case of in the one case with the auto manufacturer waste, he was able to he did use the information I provided in his business plan to present to the investors. I honestly, I don't know what the ultimate outcome of that was. With the escape room company, they were deciding based upon the research, and it kind of confirmed their intuition too, is that there definitely was more room to grow in this area. So they decided not to put on hold, opening up more locations. For the construction company, I know it helped them with their marketing and targeting of their software products to the right, to the right clients, to the right industries. So I know they definitely use that information. And in other cases, to be honest, on the feedback, the call with the client afterwards, the response was good. Whether that ended up being implemented, I honestly don't know, and that is frankly one of the, I think, frustrating parts of my job, is not always being able to see what the end results. There are certain cases that happens, but a lot of times you deliver and do not always get to see the fruits or not of your labors. So I'm curious about if other people have similar experiences, or if they have a better way to get that kind of feedback from clients, but it's definitely a challenge.
Thank you, Chad. I think a lot of our listeners can relate to that. I know I feel a lot of times my work just goes into a black hole and I never know what happens to it. It's awesome when I actually do get that feedback. So yes. Thank you. All right, we have one other question. I will try to pose this the best that I can in my understanding of it. It says, have you ever run into pseudo-data? And pseudo-data is defined as data that organizations use so they can just run their analysis. It says, talked about in the book Weapons of Mass Destruction, which I think would also make an awesome band name.
Yeah, no kidding. Or even pseudo-data. So have I run into it as in discovered that someone had put out data that was, does that mean it's just somewhat manufactured or manipulated to make things look good?
I'm gonna guess, yeah.
Yeah. I can't, that's a very, very good point. And obviously as researchers and evaluating sources, it's something we need to be conscious of. Especially if we're getting data from press releases and things. Obviously, it might be a little biased. I can't think of an explicit time when I thought that the numbers I was seeing were quite unusual. I've definitely worked with clients who it was uncomfortable because in a way they wanted to push us towards getting them a certain result. And obviously that requires some pushback on our part. But no, it's a very good point. I can't think of a time when it was evident to me that I was looking at some very, there are times where I'll see data that's not sourced that I know where it's coming from, and I think, boy, that was kind of a shady practice. But to think that this is completely unreliable and manufactured in some way. I mean, it's scary. I'm sure it's out there, but I don't know. Have you at all?
I mean, I think certainly I've seen data on presentations and other documents where nobody cites a source, and that, by virtue of not having a source, is suspect.
Yeah.
That's the most obvious example I can think of.
Right. Yeah, that's true. I mean, I would not use data if there was no source attribute, like if it was a third party and there was no attribution of the source and it was the only thing I had. Yeah, I'm definitely going to be extremely suspicious of where that came from.
Okay, so the gentleman who asked the question said he has run into it. The numbers were used to normalize results, but he doesn't find that much government space, which you would hope.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that last part?
He says not so much in the government space, which I would of course hope not, but you never know.
Exactly. Okay, well, thank you for sharing that. I mean, that's a good reminder to us that, you know, in the best of cases, we can triangulate or confirm data using another source, or to at least help us decide, yeah, that it seems reasonable that data could be the case. But definitely, in our day and age of being deluded with deluge of data, right? I'm sure there's a lot of people wanting to manipulate that to, you know, for money, for causes, for whatever. So that's a good reminder for us, I think.
Okay, so I think we might have time for one more question. Is that okay with you?
Absolutely.
Okay, so what measures were in place to determine the success of the analysis? In other words, how do you measure return on investment of your deliverables? That's an awesome question. I want to know the answer to that too.
Yeah, return on investment has definitely been a running theme since I've been attending SLA, you know, 2011, I think it was. Yeah. Well, I do not have a quantitative measure for that. What I rely on is the qualitative feedback from the clients. So the success would be that knowing that they had already done research on their side, could not come up with any data that they needed. And then to see the research and analysis that I've done, for them to say there's something new in that for them, that they learn something from this, they have a new perspective on it. That to me is a success. Does that mean it translates into millions of dollars? I don't know. But for, you know, especially for these kinds of engagements, for the client to be able to get a new perspective, to have seen data in a new way, to get them thinking, to sense their excitement on the call about being able to think about their business in a different way, right? They may have seen the same data, but it hasn't been put together in this way before. And to give them a running start with the raw data in the calculations, they can then go on and it gives them a starting place to do further analysis and research. So I would judge the success by them being enabled to look at and have access to data they wouldn't otherwise have, and for them to express that they've gotten a new perspective, you know, on their business, new insights on which direction to go. So I'm sure that does not at all provide a satisfying answer. I would love to know how to measure that return, the time I spent, and what the ultimate business value was there. But again, that kind of gets back to that issue of we don't always get that insight from the clients.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Chad, for your time today and for answering the questions that we have. And also thank you to everyone who attended our SLA CI Division webinar today. And a final reminder to thank Aurora WDC for sponsoring this event. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.